Well, good afternoon there, YouTube America and my fellow gaming enthusiasts. As once again, the Fat Man here. I want to review a book. This is off of my shelf from my collection, second edition, of course, Monster Mythology. You know, there's a dozen books left, maybe a score, but there's a lot of books that deals with deities and demigods and the pantheons and the various uh, high-powered yahoos in Dungeons and Dragons, and I see them in other game systems as well. You won't find that very many of these sort of books in science fiction genres, and other than let's take a moment and think about that for a moment. This is one of those things that sets the fantasy game, the fantasy systems apart from most of your other game systems. There are a few exceptions. Shadowrun touches on it a little bit, and that is kind of a crossover genre between science fiction and fantasy, and science fantasy, somewhere in there. But in the true hack and slash, the true fantasy RPG, this is where these things dominate. You find a large number of deities and demigods and the associated pantheons, and this occurs with the good guys, the bad guys, and the humanoids, the monsters, and oddly enough, even some of the critters. Go figure. Now, a big part of that is because it's tied into mythology. The fantasy and mythology theme is tied in heavily. This is where our early fantasy writers got most of their inspiration, if you will, and their background information was from mythology and our fantasies, our fantasy. I guess what would you call them? I hate that. When I know it, I know the words right at the tip of my head, and I just can't pull it out of there. Where's Harry Potter's one where I can just and put it in the thing? Fables and myths. There you go. We have a lot of our stuff based off of ancient history, ancient beliefs, and so the fantasy worlds are heavily drenched in that's the divine or the deity, and you can't have that. You can't have demons and devils if you don't have the gods to go with it, and that's just part of the pair. The your wizards or not your wizards, but your clerics and your paladins, your rangers. A lot of these people draw a lot of their magical abilities from their divine inspiration, their divine sources. So it just makes them critical. Now, as a game campaign, as a player, as a GM, especially as a GM, how much and how little you allow the deities into your campaign is, of course, up to you. But it also defines the tone. Now, if these characters are chosen ones from their deities, and their deities are whispering in their ears, which according to just about every deity book I've got says that's a bad idea, and to not overdo that. You don't want to make these awesome supernatural beings into mundane people. They're not the player characters are not the peers of the gods, and they never should be. They might get up at some point into some extreme epic level where they are on the ground on the same playing field as the gods' avatars or the lesser gods and the demigods and so on. But that is an entirely different thing, an entirely different subject. The lion's share, if they should be very rarely intervene. The god should very rarely intervene, and if the god is intervening more than once in a campaign set, and I don't mean in a given session, I mean in an entire campaign. Your campaign lasts for 6 months. Fradar, the barbarian's warrior god, should not intervene on his behalf or to save him more than once, if ever. Right? Now, on the other hand, there's ways to be creative about that, and with our barbarian friend might be in a bad spot, and somebody comes along and saves him, and he says, thanks to God, by the blah blah blah, thank you for saving me, and then he says, well, that's funny because I was thinking I was having a dream and I saw somebody in trouble, and so we can make that indirect connection that the God did intervene in an indirect way. Of course, there's the books talk about using avatars and lesser minions, if you will. Most of these gods have their chosen whatever their champions or their their intercessor, their interveners or whatever you want to call it. And these folks come in and I was given a vision or I felt a need to go do this, and or better yet, they just don't explain at all. You might have it in backstory so the player understands a little bit what's going on, but the character probably has no clue, and it should be left that way. I'm just saying, right? Now, when we're talking about the particular book, Monster Mythology, this book here, which I love the guys at TSR back in the day. This was the original game company, the before they sold out to the machine, uh, and yet they included, gods of the demi-humans in here, which oddly enough ought to have been a book by itself. And I don't think they could have got two books together and not had this. They'd had to fluff it out a lot more than they wanted to. But so when they call the monster mythology, it should just say mythology on it and something. Take that out altogether because putting the elves and the dwarves, the halfling gods in here right next to the goblins and kobolds and bugbears and stuff was a bit cheesy as far as I'm concerned. And I'm not going to sit here and go on and on about all the individuals because I don't. I've noticed that, and this in part has got to do with uh, money. Okay, I've got at the time when they first started coming out with this stuff, we had two major campaign worlds that were pre-made. Three, if you call Greyhawk, but Greyhawk was never developed to the extent that these other two. But you got the Dragonlance Chronicles, and you got the Forgotten Realms, and they've got gobs of novels which give you great storyline and backstory and a flavor or feel for the particular world, if you will. And both of them have their own version of this. Their gods, their deities and demigods and so forth are pretty much the same people in both game systems, except the names are different, maybe a few changes to make them stand out and make them more suited towards what's needed for the particular world itself. But the fact of the matter is, and the basic GM or the basic Dungeons and Dragons version, which is I've always said geared toward Greyhawk because that was the original game campaign world that came with the box sets back in the day. Although I can be argued, other people can argue otherwise. They used a different set of names, but the concepts are pretty much the same. You can just tweak the names to fit your whatever, but it just allowed them to create basically duplicate books based on a given realm. So Forgotten Realms has its own pantheon and everything in it, every intelligent race in it has their own gods and goddesses, and their names are different than the ones that are in this book, but they're similar at the same time, and they even make acknowledgments to that fact. And the same goes for the ones in Dragonlance. Anyway, the we're not, like I said, I'm not going on in about the individuals. What the value of this particular book and books of it similar to it, but this one here in the back it has an appendix, and one of the main part of this is this last two couple pages, avatars and gameplay. It's difficult as a GM to properly, I think, to properly represent a deity in a mundane campaign. When your character's class is average and your characters are, not, they're not used to even dealing with the nobility and the high ranking whatevers and the higher level sorcerers and famed swordsmen and so forth of their own mundane world, having the deity step in, having an avatar of the deity step in to intervene in some way is risky. It's risky. And they talk about that, and they bring it up in here a number of times. Do we risk cheapening what's going on here? On the other hand, what GM hasn't used the deities as a convenient intervention for something? Your characters are in over their heads and they need help, or somebody's on the verge of dying and there's no way to save him and is a good character, and a player would just is just heart wrenched over the idea of his character, her character being wiped out, and you can intervene from the deity's perspective. But how do you do that without it cheapening the experience or being so over the top to make it uh, cheapen in a different way? That the handful of discussions back here and examples they use on playing an avatar are very valuable. I've used them several times, and I've used them over the years to study them, if you will, to find a good way to put this in there without it becoming becoming an issue. Uh, the always the advantage, the disadvantage, the risk I found, and I made the mistake on one of my early games of having the deities intervene too often, and it became this weird pawns, cat's paw pawn play thing where a number of deities started intervening because the other one was, and next thing you know, the players found the characters themselves found themselves in the middle of uh, a one-upsman match amongst the deities, and they were starting to be visited with more deities on a regular basis, and the characters lost their awe of them after a while. The players sure did, and they started to become, I don't know, arrogant in their own mindsets that, we walk with the gods kind of thing. And they started becoming greedy and demanding and expecting more and more from these deities. And it should never have been in that way. And at some point, I had to basically end the campaign because it got out of hand. And I had no way of figuring out how to pull back, you know, once it crossed over. I couldn't bring it back out. So that was a lesson learned, not to throw these deities around very, very casually. Now, at the same venue, I've had a lot of players run and they say, "Gee, what's the point of them if we can't do that?" Well, yeah, it is kind of weird because we have gobs of material on these guys, gobs of material. They even give you stats for the gods themselves and for their avatars, and if they have them, depending on the game system. And then the argument comes back to what what was the point of all this stuff? Well, backstory, information, inspiration, ideas. It's all a good thing. Other than adding it to your shelf and letting it collect dust, which this book, after I got what I needed out of it, pretty much just sat on the shelf and not been used in 25 years. It's very rarely do I reference it. Usually it's when I'm in the middle of something and I'm in design, in the middle of trying to figure out what to do next with the group, or the group has done something in such a way that invoked the deities in particular. Maybe they're one specific deity, and I wanted to be sure of how to approach it, especially the flavor of the particular deity, because it's easy or careless of a GM to just fire from the hip when it comes to this particular situation. And while I'm an advocate of firing from the hip on a lot of things, this isn't one of them. Because a misconception in early on can change the whole flavor of a deity. And if the player character catches into that, especially if he's one of these rules doctor types, well, you know, it can get sticky and problematic over time. You know, I mean, I guess my best uh, favorite use of these guys is either from a vision perspective, they had a dream, or they had they had a visitation from something, and that they don't quite understand. Or the other side of that is the wandering stranger. This is where the avatar of this particular deity encounters the player in some situation and plays down his divinity, and but to for personal reasons or cosmic reasons, and yet at the same time leaves the character touched in some manner. At least one time, and digging back into the back vault here. At least one game we had a scenario where most of the players couldn't come, and I think I had two guys out of four show up, and the one guy had to leave early. And it's, that's a topic. Running a missing wingman campaign is a kind of a, or session is a topic for a different blog. But in this case, I think we used this. He was a cleric, and he was trying to get in touch with his deity to enhance his abilities or something. And I went with it. So I thought, well, here's a good way to kill an afternoon, and we won't have a totally lost session. We don't have to go do some one-off for entertainment purposes. And we didn't break out the card games. Of course, back then they didn't have them, but nowadays most everybody, well, let's just play some Magic the Gathering. Uh, I'm not averse to playing Magic the Gathering. I just never got into it. I don't own them. I don't own any of the cards. On the other end, I also know the dangers of that when leaching into your main game session. And next thing you know, you're off playing Magic the Gathering every weekend. You do. No. Anyway, keep in mind the deities are divine for a reason, and they should be kept in the background at all costs.